There's a big hot sun beating on the big people in a big hard world.
The UN says the number one cause of greenhouse gases is raising chickens, pigs, and other farm animals for food. Currently, the Amazon forest is being chopped down to grow soy to feed farm animals. This is funneling crops through animals, and it is the number one cause of global warming. Reducing the amount of meat we eat in our diet is the easiest way to help stop global warming. Anyone who says buy a Prius or change your light bulb or whatever else for the environment but continues to munch down on chicken nuggets and hot dogs and burgers is being very hypocritical. Al Gore has even been criticized for this. Growing crops to feed animals so we may eat the animals contribute to almost all of our environmental problems, including water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, soil erosion, and greenhouse gases. Many environmental groups send out fundraisers stating 20 things you can do to save the environment, and the number one thing to help stop contributing to greenhouse gases isn't even listed. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, the runoff from factory farms pollutes our waterways more than all other industry sources combined. The EPA reports that chicken, hog, and cattle excrement have polluted 35,000 miles of rivers in 22 states and contaminated groundwater in 17 states. It takes 16 pounds of grain and 2,500 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat. One average meat eater could consume that 1 pound of meat during a single meal, while 16 people could have been fed on the grain it takes to produce that 1 pound of meat. The meat industry causes more water pollution in the U.S. than all other industries combined because the animals raised for food produce 130 times more excrement than the entire human population, which is 86,000 pounds per second. A typical pig factory farm generates a quantity of raw waste equal to that of a city of 12,000 people. Every 2 seconds, a child starves to death somewhere in the world. Countries such as Ethiopia and some Central American countries use their farmland to supply the United States with cheap burgers instead of growing healthy grain foods for their own starving people. The livestock population of the U.S. consumes enough grain and soybeans to feed more than 5 times its human population. 90% of all corn and 80% of all grains and beans grown in the U.S. are used to feed livestock animals. 75% of U.S. topsoils have been lost to date. 80% of that loss is due to livestock rearing. A kilogram of beef is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution than driving for 3 hours while leaving all the lights on at your house. Fortunately, there is something you can do. Switch to a plant-based diet, or at least reduce your meat and dairy consumption. Now that we have talked about animals and the effects that commercial farming has on the environment, let's discuss the moral and ethical issues of eating animals. The following information is my personal philosophy on animal rights, which has been shaped by philosophers such as Peter Singer, Tom Reagan, Marianne Warren, and James Rackels. As a believer in the philosophical view of animal rights, I do not believe that everyone must coincide with a vegetarian lifestyle. However, you must either fall into one of two categories when it comes to eating meat: a person of human interest or a person of animal interest. However, whichever category you fall into, it is clear to see that it is still morally wrong to eat meat routinely. We are advancing human interests with vegetarianism. Vegetarianism isn't some noble sacrifice. It is actually in the interest of human beings. If you believe that human interests outweigh the rights of animals, then you will still come to the conclusion that you must eat meat sparingly. The raising of all animals of food is a very inefficient process. Millions of people starve to death each year, and therefore it is wrong to waste food when literally millions of people starve to death each year. There are even more people whose lives are miserable and ruined and spend all their time in a day to make sure that they get the food they need because they are chronically malnourished. Let's suppose when you're done with dinner there are small amounts of food left on the plate, and you're going to throw it away. But suppose down the street there is a child who is starving to death. Wouldn't it be morally wrong not to bring the food to this child? Furthermore, wouldn't it be wrong to throw this food away when someone will come to your home and is willing to bring the food to the starving child? There are people in this world who are willing to do all the work, and all we have to do is just give a little. The average American wastes 10% of their food. Instead of wasting that 10% of food on your dinner plate, you could just be more careful of what you buy and spend less, but eat the same amount of food and donate the rest of the money to a charity who would help feed those in need. Raising animals to be eaten wastes a very large amount of food. We grow a ton of wheat and feed it to the animals. On average, for total meat production, we get only 1 pound of protein for every 8 pounds of protein we put in. Why I have this statistic in terms of protein, you may be asking, is because when people argue that if you don't eat meat, you won't be getting enough protein, and clearly this is not the case. On average, we waste 87.5% of protein through animals. Imagine someone who declares they are vegetarian. They are guaranteed to hear from your peers, "Where are you getting all your protein?" However, we waste 7 pounds of protein to get only the 1 pound in return. The only main thing we get from meat is the protein. It's not the fat, that's unhealthy. If we don't use animals, we wouldn't have the protein issue because there would be more protein available. Cattle are amazingly inefficient. We feed them 20 pounds of protein for every 1 pound we get back. Through the human interest point of view, you may even view fishing and hunting permissible, when you are concerned solely about human interest. However, we ought not to overfish or overhunt. We can act on human interest and come to the conclusion that these are the things we ought to do. In principle, if all you're concerned about is human interest, there could be a justifiable way to eat animals. It would be a dramatic reduction, but there would still be ways as long as the human needs are met and millions of people are not starving to death every year. For the human interest view, we will still come to the conclusion that you cannot eat meat routinely. Most of us would be much more vegetarian than before. Being at the top of the food chain, we must learn to live with animals and give them rights when it is due necessary. Since the beginning of time, man has eaten animals as a way of survival, and even to this day, there are many people in the world who depend on animals as a means of food and energy. The most healthy way of living is for those of us who do not rely on animals as a source of food to eat it sparingly. A lifestyle such as this will be different for everyone, and most likely will insist on most people becoming closer to a vegetarian lifestyle than before. Because every person's situation is different, economically, physically, geographically, we must do what we would be considered minimally decent. Through a utilitarian viewpoint, you just add all the positives of eating meat and all the negatives of eating meat and try to get a net positive. So even from a utilitarian viewpoint, it's wrong to eat meat routinely because when you add up all the negatives such as shortage of food, environmental degradation, and the amount of pain and suffering caused to animals that comes from eating meat, it simply can't outweigh the positives, and therefore you get a negative. One could say, well, all the pain and suffering isn't that bad, is it? The slaughter itself is relatively quick. For example, on commercial farms, chickens are hung by their necks, and there's a blade that chops their heads off as they move down the line. This is an entirely normal process. How long it takes from when they are strung up and when they are chopped up may be quick. However, it does cause pain and suffering. Furthermore, during their lifetime, they are kept in close spaces with many other chickens, and as to make sure they don't peck at each other to death in the cages, they have their beaks cut off. Almost everywhere in the U.S. on commercial farm, male cows are routinely castrated without anesthetics. Veal calves are tied up and kept confined in small areas to prevent muscle development because it toughens the meat. This is entirely normal for most animals. It's the cheapest way to deal with the situation. If every cow were raised by organic farmers, the double cheeseburger at McDonald's wouldn't be $1, it would be 10. When we look at the amount of pain and suffering caused to the animal, it is impossible to come to the conclusion as a utilitarian viewpoint to eat meat routinely, if at all. So why is it that people really eat meat? Most people, I suppose, would say because they like it and the taste is good. If you adopt this perspective at all, that animals have rights, even if you think those rights are weaker than ours, does liking the way the animal tastes justify taking its life? Is that the right kind of reason? Living in the 18th century in cold Prussia, it would be almost impossible not to get through the winter without eating meat. When you think about that world, it is true that people relied on and needed to rely on this kind of food. But this now is plainly not the case. We now live in a world with factory farming. Now that we bring this into view, notice how when we add it all up, all the cows, pigs, chickens, We are talking about billions of animals a year being run through the industrial mechanism as if they are the metal gears and not the animals they really are. What does it say about us? We owe it to ourselves to be the kind of person who does not do this.